E3, 1995. This was the first E3, and it was a big deal. Before E3, there was not really a dedicated time and place where big gaming announcements were getting made. In Europe, you would have the European Computer Trade Show, and individual companies might have their own events, but for the most part, everybody was just going to the Consumer Electronics Show. Since CES was the premier tech expo, it made sense that gaming would just kind of force its way into that event, but it never really fit in. With the flood of new TVs and phones and computers and gadgets every year, this interactive entertainment thing was just kinda out of place. A lot of people attending these shows had no interest in video games, and really the organizers of these events didn't seem to care much either. Console manufacturers and publishers were treated like garbage. They would get sent to the back of the show where nobody had to look at them. There's stories of rain pouring down on the newly announced Genesis because CES only provided an outdoor tent for Sega's big gaming showcase. Over the years, this poor treatment turned to resentment. It was clear that gaming wasn't welcome at CES, but there just wasn't an alternative. Gaming was kinda niche, but it was starting to get more attention, but not the good kind. In the early 90s in the United States, there was a growing concern by parents and Congress about the influx of violence and inappropriate content in video games. It was a big deal, a lot of stuff happened, but in short, the government basically gave the gaming industry an ultimatum. Either come together, settle your differences, and form an association to regulate yourselves, or the government's gonna do it for you. While Nintendo and Sega despised each other, it was in everybody's best interest to keep government oversight out of gaming. So the various manufacturers and publishers formed the Interactive Digital Software Association, also known as the IDSA, although today it's known as the ESA. They created the ESRB rating system, which got the government off their backs. Now this happened in 1994, but it had another major side effect. Now that all of these businesses had teamed up, even in just this limited capacity, it opened up the possibility for another kind of team up. A trade show. This idea originally came from the creator of the GamePro magazine, Pat Farrell, who managed to convince some of the big publishers to hold their own expo, just for gaming, rather than rely on CES. He had connections to IDG, an organization that had created the Macworld Expo, so there was a sense that this could be done. Now, it wasn't gonna be easy. Getting everybody on board was going to be a challenge. Nintendo and Microsoft were notorious holdouts. They wanted to stick with CES. But once it became clear that every other publisher was going to this new event, they had to concede. Pat managed to make a deal with the IDSA, and because of this, the first E3 was announced for May 1995 at the Los Angeles Convention Center. Now, this was the perfect time for this kind of event. In 1995, the gaming industry was changing, and its future was unpredictable. At the time, the Super Nintendo was still the most popular console in North America, but everybody's interest was on the new hardware. The year prior, Sega and Sony had launched next-gen 3D machines in Japan, the Saturn and the PlayStation. 3D gaming was here to stay, and people already knew what these boxes could do and what games were going to be released, so this E3 was really just about getting the hype train rolling for the North American launch of the hardware later that year. Nintendo had announced their Ultra 64 prior to E3. But just days before the event, it was announced that this console would not be releasing until next year. So going into E3 1995, nobody really knew whether Sega, Sony, or Nintendo would come out on top. But the focus was really on that Sega and Sony battle. Also, the 3DO existed. And the Jaguar. Now, if you don't know, E3 can kind of be divided into two parts. You have the show floor in the exhibits where each of the publishers show off game demos and the booths. So many booths. And then you have the conferences, the presentations. You know, some dude goes on stage and he announces something cool. The crowd goes wild, people cheer, Peggle too. These conferences are the most memorable and exciting parts of E3 for those watching at home. But in 1995, nobody was watching at home. You couldn't live stream these presentations on the internet. You weren't gonna watch them on G4. The only people who were going to watch these presentations were the people sitting there at the presentation. At best, people would read about new announcements in a few weeks when the new gaming magazines got published. You didn't have special guest stars and musical performance. You wouldn't even really see gameplay. These were not even officially filmed presentations because they weren't intended to be viewed by the general public. The only reason we can even watch these is because somebody in the crowd decided to record this with their camcorder. So the footage might be a bit blurry. It might be a bit hard to understand what they're saying. But the biggest difference between these early E3 conferences and the kind of shows that you might expect later is the intended audience. The point of these presentations was not to convince viewers to go out and pre-order new games or get excited. They weren't looking to win the hearts of gamers, because the gamers weren't watching. Almost everybody in attendance was people who worked in or with the video game industry, and a lot of these individuals might not even care about playing games. You would have representatives from retailers who stock these consoles, developers who are making new games, employees of the publishers, marketing teams, investors, and maybe a few gaming journalists. So what I'm trying to say here is that these shows can be a bit dry for modern tastes. There was also no precedent for what an E3 conference should be, so this is uncharted waters. And let's dive in. The first show I'm going to start with is Sega, presented by the one and only Tom Kalinske. If you don't know who Tom is, well, he's a cool dude. He starts the show by ripping on CES, which is appropriate because, they caused his Sega Genesis to get wet all those years ago. But he really starts the show off with a discussion on video game myths that Tom is going to disprove with facts. The first myth is PC gaming. Yeah, it's not real. It's a myth. Okay, for some context, around this time the console manufacturers were genuinely worried that PC gaming might replace game consoles. Windows 95 was releasing in a few months, and multimedia computing was the hot new thing. Nobody really knew what kind of impact this would have on the console market. Would people still buy dedicated gaming boxes if they had a computer that could play movies and music and do all the same things? This is what Tom wanted to address.
Multimedia PCs have sold fast over the last 2 years. They are, at first blush, obvious platforms for the increasingly sophisticated games our audiences are calling for. And those PC sales numbers will be a compelling message to game developers out there. And if I've just spent $1,700 to $3,000 or more on a new multimedia platform for my home office, don't I want to get as much use out of that expense as possible?
So Tom says, well, PCs will not replace consoles because PCs are expensive. Gaming PCs with fancy chips and cards and all the bells and whistles that you would want would be thousands of dollars. And in 1995, that was a lot of money. Game consoles, on the other hand, were cheap. He mentions how 10% of homes have multimedia computers, but 30% have dedicated game consoles. I don't think that's a great point. More people are going to buy computers in the future, and I think Tom already knows that. But the thing he's trying to say here is that consoles and PCs appeal to different people. He says that PC gaming is for hobbyists, people willing to pay a lot of money for a great experience, and people willing to put up with the drivers and the updates and the compatibility issues. Consoles are for people who just want to slap at a disc, press a button, and start playing a game. And that's fair, especially in 1995. He compares PCs to sports cars and consoles to minivans. Just because one exists doesn't mean people don't want the other. He also talks about online gaming and how in the future people will download video games. In fact, they can do it right now with the Sega channel. PCs and consoles might be different, but the consoles can adopt some of the new technologies taking off in the PC ecosystem. And yeah, this is all spot on. This is great. A lot of good insights, but he does say something that catches me off guard. He talks about how a lot of PC owners are businessmen who might buy video games for their kids, and they don't want their kids messing around on their PC trying to play a video game. He says it's just easier to buy a box, plop it in the living room, and your kids won't bother you. It's supposed to be an example of how convenient consoles are compared to PCs, but it does come off like he's saying adults aren't playing video games, they're just buying games for their kids. Now again, this was 1995, and that was kind of the general consensus. But then he throws a curveball. He moves on to the second myth. This one being that video games are only made for children, and he's going to talk about why that's not true. Back in the 90s, most people, almost everybody, seemed to view video games as a children's toy. It was something that kids played, maybe teenagers, but when you became an adult, you stopped. Now this wasn't true, of course. A lot of adults played video games even in the 90s, but this was just how the general public viewed the medium. Most adults didn't grow up playing video games around this time, and they just saw games as something that kids would play. Nintendo leaned heavily into marketing the NES as a child's toy in North America to try and revitalize the console market after the '83 crash. But that perception of video games as something for kids, and only for kids, was still around. Sega had tried to aim for an older demographic, and now it seemed to be paying off. Tom says that the target demographic for video games as a whole was shifting. In the early 90s, most games were purchased by 6 to 17-year-olds. Now, by the mid-90s, almost half of people playing and buying games were adults. Tom suspected that within a few years, given this trend, a majority of gamers would soon be 18 or older. And he talks about how Sega wants to appeal to this new market. And this is a shift in Sega's vision. Tom presents the future of gaming as a new exciting medium, a new frontier. This 3D technology that the Sega Saturn and other hardware would bring would start a revolution. Gaming as a medium would transcend into something new. He talks about how in the future, games will have compelling stories. Adults will imagine themselves as being professional race car drivers or football players and live those fantasies through those games. This is exciting. Like, I know what happens 28 years later, but it's still exciting, and I can see Tom's excited. It's a lot of good points, but there's a few odd statements in here as well. He seems to equate side-scrolling games as games for children, and suggests that this genre, 2D gaming, would disappear within a few years. I understand this thinking, given that most seem to assume that 2D games were objectively antiquated compared to the 3D immersion, but that's still a missed prediction, Tom. You were wrong, Tom. But overall, it's a good series of points. He mentions how Sega isn't giving up entirely on kids, it's still going to make games that everybody enjoys, but gaming is growing up. He takes a few shots at Sony and Nintendo, Sony for being the newbie and Nintendo for not having a large arcade presence. He shows off Virtua Fighter to accentuate this. Now on the Sega Saturn, but our cameraman doesn't seem to want to focus on the gameplay. He just keeps the camera on Tom. By the 20-minute mark, we're on to sales predictions. Yay, E3. Yeah, I told you it's gonna be pretty dry. He mentions how successful the Saturn was at launch in Japan, and gives some arguably optimistic sales expectations for North America. He does bring up how Sega isn't necessarily winning the console war, but that doesn't really matter because the gaming industry as a whole is going to continue to grow, and games will just become more popular and everybody wins. Now that is a very smooth way to say we're losing, and I appreciate that. The Saturn is promoted as a way to bring the arcade experience home, which makes sense because many of Saturn's most anticipated games were ports of arcade titles. At the time, arcades could do a lot of things that consoles and consumer-grade PCs were nowhere close to, so the idea of having a personal arcade was kind of a big deal. He makes a jab at Nintendo for not having new hardware ready yet, and then he talks about bits. Bits were often used as a measure of a console's performance, kind of like how teraflops are used today. The bit wars were confusing and often misleading. The SNES was 16 bits, the PlayStation was 32 bits. The Jaguar was inconclusive, and the Ultra 64 would be 64 bits. Now the Saturn was a 32-bit console, kind of. It had some weird CPU stuff going on, but Tom talks about how this doesn't really matter.
A custom sound chip and a digital signal processor yields up to 32 voices in CD quality audio. But I said the message wasn't technical, didn't I? The fact is, parallel multiple processing, such as we employ on Sega Saturn, makes bit counting an obsolete exercise. If you want to play that game, we could say Sega Saturn's a 128-bit system, but I won't do that, I promise. Because gameplay, graphics, speed, control, sound, and game design, all yielding magic, not bits. Gameplay will be evaluated on the magic it provides.
You're losing me, Tom. Tom talks about how Sega's marketing budget for the next few months is astounding. They're gonna spend so much money because they are so incredibly confident in the future success of the Sega Saturn. Then we get some ad spots. Not game ads necessarily, just ads. There's this new ad campaign that's trying to show off how the human body reacts to Sega games. And they're trying to show the experience of playing a game without showing the game.
Optic nerve. This is the brain. What's going on down there?
The eardrum's going off! Go get help!
We're having a breakdown, we're having a breakdown, we're having a breakdown, having a breakdown, we're having a breakdown.
What else can go wrong?
Urgent synapse on line 2. It's the sphincter.
What is going on up there?
Okay, so the ending of this conference is infamous. It's one of the most infamous moments in E3 history. Remember that the entire point of this presentation was to promote the Sega Saturn before its planned North American launch on September 2nd, 1995. This was going to be a big launch day called Saturn Day, with a huge media event with all this advertising spent to promote these new exciting games on day one. But Sega of Japan was really worried about the Sony PlayStation. Now remember, both their consoles had released in Japan already. In Japan, the PlayStation wasn't beating the Saturn, but a lot of that was because Sega was riding off of the success of its arcade games. Stuff like Virtua Fighter was massive in Japan, but that success might not translate to North America. And Sega of Japan felt like they needed an edge for the North American launch. They wanted to get an early start on Sony. So Sega of Japan told Tom to do something terrible.
We started our rollout of Sega Saturn yesterday. We're at retail today in 1,800 Toys R Us, software, etc., and electronic boutique stores around the US and Canada. Our retail price is between $399 and $449.
This console that was not supposed to release for 4 months has already been shipped to several retail partners. You can go into a store and buy one today. And it costs $399. Sega didn't tell anybody that they were doing this, that they were moving the launch up 4 months. Nobody had games ready. Some of the big retailers had no idea that this was happening. So they were incredibly angry that they didn't receive the Saturns early. They thought, why did these retailers get some and we didn't? The gaming press didn't really seem to understand the motivations either. I mean, again, this wasn't being live streamed. Very few people had access to the internet. So nobody knew that the Saturn had released. The only people that knew were the people in the room right then. Sega said that they were going to run some TV ads later tonight and make the big announcement, and gaming magazines would talk about it later, but still, in that $399 price, that was expensive. That would be about $800 today. Now, none of this was Tom's fault, but it's hard to watch nonetheless. And the fallout after this was tremendous. Some retailers were so offended that Sega had not provided them with Saturns that they refused to sell the console. It hurt the relationship between Sega and some massive stores like Walmart and Best Buy. Developers felt cheated. They were expecting to see some good sales on these launch titles they were working on. Yeah, this was a rough one. For a first E3 conference, the majority of the show is not bad. It's not really exciting, it doesn't have huge announcements, but it is compelling and hopeful for the future. Tom's predictions of what gaming will become are mostly spot on. But that ending, that is all that this conference would ever be remembered for. Later on, Tom would talk about how he fought against these decisions, but Sega of Japan mandated this. But this was just such terrible timing. Before the show, Sega was pretty much going pound for pound with Nintendo in North America. They had expertly managed to take on the biggest name in gaming, and a lot of people were excited for their next console. But by announcing that this console was releasing today, it was clearly an attempt to get a jump on Sony, and it didn't work. It just made everybody angry at Sega. Everybody in the industry was questioning why would they even want to work with them. I think Sega of Japan grossly overestimated their position in the industry. They might have been number 2 in consoles, but they were on shaky ground. I mean, consumers were already confused about the number of accessories and add-ons for the Genesis, and now retailers and developers were against the company. They had placed their trust in Sega and felt betrayed. Maybe in a vacuum, this wouldn't have been such a bad conference. It would have been one bad console launch. But it's what happened immediately afterwards that made this moment so significant. So immediately following Sega's conference, Sony was taking the stage. Sony was an interesting player in the console war. They were the outsiders, the newcomers, and while nowadays that might be an issue, it actually helped them quite a bit. I mean, they were Sony in the 90s. The guys that made the Walkman and the CDs and the TVs and the headphones. They dominated the consumer electronics market, dominated the living room. And the idea that this huge brand, this popular brand, was getting into gaming just gave them more credibility. It gave credibility to the PlayStation name. But Sony had even more than that going for it. While the PlayStation didn't take over Japan, there were big expectations for the product's launch in North America. They had spent the past few years cozying up to every developer they could. They tried to get more people to make games for this platform, and it wasn't that difficult to convince people to move from Nintendo or even Sega over to Sony. Developers just didn't like Nintendo. For years, many teams found the company controlling and anti-competitive. While Nintendo was the market leader, developers wanted a good alternative, a new alternative. Now that could have came from the 3DO, which didn't really take off. Could have came from Atari, which companies had issues with as well. So now it was really down to Sega or Sony. But the Sega Saturn was confusing for some developers to work on. The PlayStation was simple. Nintendo was absolutely out of the question because they were sticking with cartridges rather than CDs. And cartridges cost more for the developers to produce. And after that bombshell just minutes prior, Sony was really the one to beat. They were the new favorite, as long as they could stick the landing.
The world's first successful transistor radio.
The combination that started it all. Smaller is better. And bigger is...
So the conference starts off with a discussion of how, Sony is the outsiders. They're the tech company getting into gaming, and that gives them a new perspective. But the conference overall is pretty much identical to what Sega did. I mean, they start off talking about PC gaming and how computers aren't going to replace consoles.
Consumers expect plug and play. They want to plug in the hardware, insert the software, and begin to play immediately. Tom Kalinske and I agree on this 100%.
They discuss how 16-bit gaming was simplistic, and they rip a lot on these 2D 16-bit games. They mention sports and riddle-based puzzle games. Now, I don't know what a riddle-based puzzle game is, but I have a bad feeling that Sony was talking about RPGs, and they thought that instead of role-playing game, that RPG stood for riddle-based puzzle game. They talk about how lame Sonic and Mario is, and how the future is 3D. Every company seemed to just want to make 2D gaming seem like it was for kids, and how 3D gaming was for men. Which I don't agree with, obviously, but I see what they're trying to do here. This is supposed to be a new gaming revolution. This isn't your dad's Nintendo. But with Sony specifically, I don't know. It feels kind of weird. Like they're coming in and ripping on the classics. Like Sega could kind of get away with trash talk and side-scrolling games because they made a lot of them. But Sony, you're the new guy here. Have some respect. Don't go insulting Super Mario World.
Introducing Sony PlayStation, the breakthrough that takes gamers deeper into the game. It's totally immersive entertainment, and it forever changes the rules of the game, putting players in command of the most powerful game console ever. With multiple custom Sony processors, it's the rush of power, man!
Overall, overall it's a pretty bland show, if I'm being completely honest. There's talk about Sony's development partners, which is impressive, but for the most part, it's standard fare. Not a whole lot of new information or announcements, just vague marketing speak. But that's kind of what I like about this. The way Sony is marketing the PlayStation brand in 1995 is pretty genius. Sony was aware, just like Sega, that gaming was no longer just for kids. They wanted to appeal to an older demographic, but they went about it in a very different way from Sega. I think Sega's advertising strategy was amazing for the time, but they always kind of came off like a company trying to appeal to older teenagers. They were edgy and unexpected, and they tried to have some shock value to get people interested. It's what teenagers would like and what kids imagined was more mature. Even during E3, Sega's conference felt like it was meant for the businessmen in the crowd, talking about how maybe one day gaming would be for adults. But Sony seems to want to convince these people in the crowd, the journalists, the investors, that gaming is for them right now. And they did this masterfully. They did this by leveraging their outsider status as a tech company. The PlayStation is presented like not a game console, but any other piece of Sony tech. It's just technology, not a toy. It's subtle the way they do this, but it works. Like Sega had spent its conference trying to convince people that the Saturn would bring the arcade experience home. But Sony comes up here and says the PlayStation is like an inexpensive workstation, designed specifically for entertainment. Now this is all just marketing. Sony had no history in gaming before this, so they created their own image. So at the end, we start getting into the important parts of the conference. The most important part of the conference, the price. The crowd laughs when Sony mentions affordability, since it's a clear dig at Sega for announcing that $399 price point for the Saturn. Then,
some of you might actually want to know what that price is. Since it's a beautiful day here in Los Angeles, I'm going to ask Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Reyes, to join me for a brief presentation. $299.
this is definitely the most memorable moment from E3 1995, but honestly, it might be the most important moment in E3 history. Maybe gaming history. This is the moment that Sony went from an unproven newcomer to the industry's new favorite. It also kinda killed Sega and maybe killed Atari. Like, here was a new console that was easy to make games for, that was cheaper to make games for, that was cheaper than the competition. Sony had developers on their side, they had retailers on their side, and now they would have consumers on their side. I don't think that this $299 moment is the only reason why PlayStation succeeded, but it was the moment that PlayStation won the console war. It's the moment that they established themselves as the new king of the industry. Like, everything had just come together so perfectly. The fact this was moments after Sega's conference, and the theatrics of all of this, to just go so confidently up on stage, and just have a clear shot at Sega. What Sony really achieved on this day was the product of years of planning and opportunity and insight, but that price was more or less made up on the spot. Leading up to the conference just hours before, Sony's American teams were debating the Japanese divisions on whether the PlayStation should cost $299 or $399 in North America. The decision was made near the last minute to go with $299. That's why the $299 speech is so short, because nobody knew the price until the last few hours. But this had a huge effect on the industry. Everyone who was burned by Sega just went straight for PlayStation. Sony's presence on the show floor was also just a perfect storm. They got a great reaction. And apparently Sony, the corporation, was concerned that the PlayStation would be a massive failure in North America. So before this point, Sony didn't want their brand name featured too prominently on the PlayStation's box, just in case it hurt Sony's good name. But after this E3, all of that changed. Sony's higher-ups were convinced that this would be a success. The positive reaction to all of this was enough for them to double down. And yeah, between Sega and Sony obviously won. But they weren't the last conference. We had a few more players here, including Nintendo, the market leader. Yeah, Sony might have bested Sega, but remember, you got the big man with the mustache to contend with. And Nintendo was kind of a mystery. Like, what were they working on? What were they going to show off here? Turns out, nothing. I think Nintendo's 1995 E3 conference is the worst E3 conference ever. Yes, Sega made a huge mistake that probably resulted in them leaving the console industry, but still, it was a pretty interesting show, entertaining at the bare minimum. Nintendo's 1995 conference is just as bad as it gets. Remember, Nintendo wasn't interested in attending E3 before this. They were fine with CES, and they were a fairly late addition. They had a large presence on the show floor, but they didn't really have anything of substance prepared for the presentation. And our speaker is the notorious Howard Lincoln. If you don't know anything about Howard Lincoln, he's notorious.
Incidentally, last week the Wall Street Journal said that some people in this industry think that I'm either a visionary or an idiot. I'm not really sure who these people are or which side of the fence they're on, but just to avoid any confusion, I decided this morning to wear my visionary hat.
Nintendo was kind of in a bad position in 1995. Yes, the SNES was the best-selling game console at the time, but as Sony and Sega had mentioned, gamers were getting older, and Nintendo had spent the past decade doing everything in their power to convince both consumers and the government that they were only interested in making products for children. While Sony and Sega were talking about this new gaming revolution, Nintendo was losing relevance. I mean, the fact that the Genesis even managed to compete effectively in North America should have been a wake-up call. Developers weren't happy with Nintendo, a lot of people were not happy with Nintendo, but Nintendo didn't care. In fact, they kinda seemed to assume that they already won the console war, that they were the kings of console gaming, and this was a costly mistake. Lincoln mentions how Nintendo isn't moving to the next gen as quickly as the competition, but they still have compelling 16-bit games.
Game players always recognize quality, and they enthusiastically flock to it. Witness the 7.5 million Donkey Kong Country cartridges that we have sold worldwide since last November.
He talks about Donkey Kong Country, and how that game was so good, it raised the standard of gaming forever. He mentions the Virtual Boy, not any game specifically. I mean, he just mentions it, like it's at E3, go try it out, it's garbage. There's not a lot of excitement here. It feels like Lincoln could not care less about these video games or the audience and whether they care about video games. Like, the way he talks about all of this is like these are just products for stupid kids to buy. We don't really get any announcements here, but we do get a mention of Nintendo's upcoming hardware, the Ultra 64.
Beyond Donkey Kong Country, and certainly in my mind, to a level equal to any of the 32-bit software being exhibited here at E3. What this means is that the quality of video games now under development for Nintendo Ultra 64 simply must be better, much better, not just a little bit, but a lot.
Now, the ending of the conference is just so bizarre. It is a long rant about the evils of game piracy. That's it. We get statistics of which regions are pirating games, discussions about the newfangled cyberspace and how cyber pirates are gonna steal games.
Mary Beth Peters, the Registrar of Copyrights, recently called the internet the biggest copying machine in the world. And author William Gibson, who coined the term cyberspace in the early 1980s, also established the now familiar dramatic conflict between so-called heroes in the form of computer hackers against villains cast as evil multinationals. Unfortunately, some in the media have accepted this nonsense. They too sometimes celebrate the hacker hero. And this in turn is acted to help authenticate the absurd rationalization, and I quote, information wants to be free.
That's it. That's how he ends the conference. I get that there was no expectations for what an E3 conference should be in 1995. This was the first show, but this is just terrible.
We need to educate everyone who is entertained by our products about the need for protection of intellectual property. And if we do this, we're going to eventually win this counterfeiting battle, not only for our employees and for our shareholders, but for the sake of every person around the world who enjoys interactive entertainment. Thank you very much.
You have your competition announcing new hardware, getting people excited. Sony has just won the console war, and you decide to spend your time lecturing journalists and retailers about piracy. Now, to be honest, I think the only reason this speech is here is because Nintendo wanted to stoke some fears about CD-based gaming. They wanted to convince people that CD gaming will be rampant with piracy while cartridges will be safe. But this argument is not compelling. It's not exciting to the people in the crowd, to the journalists, to the retailers who probably also care about piracy. But it doesn't help Nintendo's image at this point. They don't even present a way to fix this issue, to combat piracy. They just talk about how more legislation should be passed. While Sony was talking about how great the PlayStation will be for developers, and Sega is trying to convince people that gaming is about to change forever, Nintendo was just over here complaining that people in India are stealing Nintendo games. That's it. That's the entire end of this conference. And it goes on for a while. So yeah, this is the worst E3 conference of all time. I really do believe that. It's not a bunch of announcements for games that would maybe be disappointing. It's not anything. I'm sure a lot of this was because there was no expectations for what E3 should be. It's probably because Nintendo didn't have much to show. But even still, while Sega and Sony understood that this was a pivotal moment for the future of the industry, and they were trying their best to drum up some excitement and hype for the future, Nintendo was completely stuck in the past. You really get the sense that Nintendo was getting left behind here. That all of these strategies that had worked to build up their console empire were now obsolete. The fact that Lincoln just doesn't address the crowd like they could possibly be interested in these games. This sense that these are just products to sell to children. It's so far removed from what Sega and especially Sony was doing. Like, Nintendo clearly had not realized the potential of what games could be, and while the industry was in the midst of this revolution, they are just so arrogantly content with the incorrect assumption that they were going to remain on top. This is the start of Nintendo's downfall, one that they would not fully recover from for a very long time. I want to keep moving on to what might be the most interesting conference of the year. In fact, it might be the first real E3 conference by modern standards. Something that was quite ahead of its time, but not always for the best reasons. This is the 3DO presentation. I'm not going to do a grand retrospective on 3DO today. It was a fascinating concept in a company, but I just want to focus on this conference specifically. For a bit of context, the 3DO was created by EA's original founder, Trip Hawkins. It wasn't an individual game console, but rather a series of specifications that manufacturers could follow to make their own 3DOs. This ended up including Panasonic, Gold Star, now known as LG, amongst others who just wanted to get into the game console game without developing their own hardware. There was very low royalties for game titles, making it an appealing box for developers and manufacturers alike, but this all came at a cost. Literally. Because the manufacturers of these consoles couldn't rely on accessories or game sales to offset these costs, each console had to be sold for a profit, which meant they were very, very expensive. This meant that the 3DO launched at a price of $699 in 1993. That would be about $1,400 today. And that's the other thing. It launched in 1993, and while it was revolutionary at the time, 2 years on, this wasn't really going to offer any major surprises. It sold well, but not well enough. And this E3 showcase was really 3DO's last chance for survival. The first half of the conference isn't all that interesting or important, really. We get yet another discussion about how consoles won't get replaced by PCs.
The dedicated market has been very cyclical. Every time there's a down cycle in the dedicated market, the guys in the PC market say, The video game is dead, long live the PC. You don't need a dedicated system. A PC can do everything. Technically that may be accurate, but that's a little bit like telling a family that they only really need one car, or if they were going to get two cars, maybe.
Along with a set of slides showing 3DO's meager sales performance up to this point. You get some lists of some upcoming titles, and what I can only describe as a desperate attempt to convince people that the 3DO won't be completely outclassed by the upcoming Saturn and PS1. This all really comes off as the company saying, don't forget about us, we're still in the fight, which, I'm sorry guys, but you kinda lost. Between the race of Sony, Sega, and Nintendo, 3DO was a non-participant by this point, and everybody knew it. But that's why the second half of the presentation is so interesting. 3DO was working on a new console, originally designed as an upgrade chip, but now it was a full next-gen console. Not next-gen as in PlayStation or Saturn or Nintendo 64. This wasn't 5th gen, this was a 6th gen console, being announced in 1995. Not since generations aren't based on power, but when they release, I don't know how accurate this statement was ever going to be, but they were ambitious. The console was called the M2, and this E3 was their chance to show it off. Now we get a bit of some technical explanations, the kind of stuff that you might see at GDC, but then the show takes a turn. They start showing off games from other consoles, and comparing this to what the M2 will do. They show footage of Doom running on the 32X, and then compare it to this unnamed FPS demo, supposedly running on the M2. Yeah, that's not a video game, that's a movie. Nothing was gonna look like this in the 90s. Nothing ever looked like this because it's CGI. But for some reason they made the effort to fake some frame rate drops. The destruction of this table is just not realistic for 1995 gaming. We also get to see Daytona USA running on the Saturn. We'll compare it to this unnamed racing game on the M2. Yeah, cameras don't look like this for one, but the lighting, the motion blur, that's CGI. These particle effects, that's not gonna happen. And it's funny because the guy that's filming this with his camcorder keeps making comments about how games will absolutely not look like this, and this is so unrealistic.
Notice how flat the surfaces are.
Yeah, but it's still a good game.
What a difference.
It's too bad it won't look like that. And then you woke up.
Which is true. Now, not everything from the M2 demos seems fake. Like this graphics demo showing a dinosaur and a girl kicking at something, that looks realistic. It actually looks pretty good. It's beyond what I think the PlayStation or Saturn would be capable of, and a lot closer to something like the Sega Dreamcast, which wouldn't have been released for another 3 years. But yeah, for 1995, this is the closest you're gonna get to a modern E3 conference, because it's just a lot of baseless promises in CGI trailers. While our cameraman isn't fooled by any of this, the audience is, and they love it. The crowd erupts into cheers. This is astonishing. This is so far beyond the competition, and I can't blame them for being excited. Now, to be fair, Trip Hawkins even says that this is just what they would expect the M2 games to look like. But back in the mid-90s, the idea of faking a CGI trailer for games just wasn't as common as it would be today. I don't think most people would instantly assume, oh, that's definitely fake. Regardless, these were crowd pleasers. This is the first time at E3 that the show seemed directed towards gamers and the public, really trying to excite the audience rather than the professionals in the crowd. Because the professionals were gonna know that this wasn't realistic. Sure, it's a bit scummy, maybe a bit misleading, but it's fun. Isn't it?
There's another transparency factor, which is fog.
A little too slow.
But even still, this would be 3DO's first and final E3. In fact, by the time the next E3 rolled around, 3DO sold the rights of the M2 to the company known today as Panasonic, and that console never released. 3DO was in a bind in 1995. They needed to create headlines and generate interest as quickly as possible. Because of all that, they were forced to do something bold to really try and differentiate themselves from the competition. They took this thing seriously because they had to, and eventually every company would learn that they should take this seriously. And sure, these demos were a bit overly optimistic, or maybe even dishonest, but I think as a conference, this is some of the coolest stuff you could see from E3 1995. While Sega and Sony were trying to convey what the future of gaming might be with words and descriptions, in slideshows, 3DO was showing this off. Sure, it was to promote a console that would never be made and would have never played anything like this, but hey, they tried. Now, there were more exhibitors, other publishers who showed off games and likely, maybe, had presentations, but I can't find footage of them. But the show floor itself looks pretty interesting. It looks fun. You get to see some stuff like Donkey Kong Country 2, and there's some amazing Mortal Kombat 3 exhibits.
Howard Williams, we're aggressively continuing our leadership role by coordinating game design and marketing under one roof for both the arcade and the home. At the forefront of these new games is the colossal continuation of the Mortal Kombat series. Mortal Kombat 3!
It's odd because it's cheesy, but it's also intended for professionals. And then they go straight from all of this into discussing how successful this product will be for retailers and the marketing strategy. Which makes sense, because this booth, I guess, was for the marketing team promoting the Mortal Kombat brand rather than Mortal Kombat itself.
And it's a strategy that, when combined with our thrilling title, has continuously produced phenomenal retail success. Another example of this retail success is that unqualified cyberspace mega hit, Doom!
Now, there was one more console exhibitor at the show, but I can't find a presentation from them. It was Atari. And honestly, they're almost not even worth mentioning by this point. The Atari Jaguar had released in 1993. It was much like the 3DO, an aging console, but nobody was paying attention to them by 95. There's a lot of reasons the Jaguar failed. It had a bizarre controller, a lackluster game lineup, but by 1995, the technology was completely outdated. The Jaguar was a complete failure. Atari was making its last-ditch effort here to keep the platform alive with the new Jaguar CD and Jaguar VR add-ons, and neither were getting a lot of attention. Sure, the Jaguar VR seemed kind of impressive for the time especially, and it was way more impressive than the Virtual Boy, but that thing would never get released. Atari was really trying to sell itself as the inexpensive alternative to the next-gen hardware, but with the PlayStation now costing $299, Atari just had no chance. To be honest, it almost feels like Atari is just here to try and get rid of some unsold Jaguar stock.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share with the people at home regarding Atari's future and your plans and how you fit into Atari?
Well, I think if you look at the overall package of Atari products, including VR, which is definitely a breakthrough, we have the fastest tracking mechanism ever made, and at a target price point of $300 for a home system, we'll be the first in the home with real VR, immersive VR, not black and white, not non-immersive VR, but real arcade-style VR. Once you've played these games, you don't want to play any other kind of games. It's a much better experience. Jaguar will deliver so much more in terms of CD and JagLink, which is a way to play two Jaguar systems, one to another, Jag modem, 6-button controllers. We've got many, many new products coming.
And this was really the last time you'd see this incarnation of the company at the show. And that's E3 1995 for you. This E3 was different. It really was unlike any other E3. Not just because it was the first. I mean, it wasn't even organized by the ESA or the IDSA at the time. It was ran by IDG, that separate agency that GamePro's founders had connections with. But after this, the IDSA, or ESA, saw the value in an annual trade show for gaming and acquired the rights to E3, because it was a massive success. 50,000 people showed up, and these press conferences were suddenly a big deal. I mean, E3 had already had an impact, a tangible effect on the industry. There were winners and losers at this trade show, and it set the stage for what E3 would become. But overall, this show was it was weird. The console war was a constant talking point. Every company made direct jabs at the competition, going as far as showing footage from these competitors' games and then insulting them. I think the winner of the show was clearly Sony. They didn't show a lot, but they didn't need to. The mic drop price announcement was just too good. I don't know if any company has ever won E3 as good as Sony did here. It took them from a newbie and kind of the underdog to the unparalleled victors of the console war for the next 2 generations. The loser was Sega. This decision by Sega of Japan, the $399 plus it's out now, burned so many bridges, and it set into motion the events that would cause Sega to eventually leave the console industry altogether. So yeah, nobody has ever lost E3 worse than Sega lost here. Now the conference itself was still entertaining, and Tom's points about the gaming industry are insightful. It wasn't Tom's fault. As I said, he tried to stop this. But Sega didn't just lose E3. They lost the console industry on this day. And Nintendo, yeah, that was the worst conference I've ever seen. It wasn't the worst conference from the effects on it, but just watching it, oh man. It did not help Nintendo one bit, but it didn't really hurt them because they might as well have just not shown up, and it would not have changed the outcome. It was a non-show. The fact that the Virtual Boy is kind of the most referenced thing from this year just tells you how bad it really got. 3DO had the most interesting conference. It was bold, unrealistic, but it was cool. I'm sure if I was watching all of these live in 1995, I would have said that 3DO wins because that M2 looks awesome. But in hindsight, it's clearly the last gasps of a dying company. But in this moment, I'm sure it was great, and the crowd loved it. As for my game of the year, that's kind of difficult to decide. The conferences did not have any game announcements. In fact, you barely saw any gameplay footage during any of these presentations. Most of these games were already released in Japan by this point as well, or they were ports of arcade titles. But since I should pick a winner, I'm gonna say Ridge Racer. I don't know, that looks fun. I hope it's a good game. Nowadays, I think E3 1995 is mostly disregarded as the boring here. I think part of this is because nothing was really announced, and most of the presentations are just PowerPoints and sales figures. But I think from a historical perspective, it is one of the most interesting E3s. There's a real sense that the industry is unsure of itself, like they have something to prove that video games are a legitimate form of media or art. And each company has a different approach that really does reflect their attitudes at the time. Sega is optimistic, but they're on the defensive. Tom Kalinske seems more interested in what's coming next rather than what's here now. Nintendo was just apathetic, arrogant, and had virtually no concern of what was happening in the industry beyond Nintendo. There was simply no love for gaming in this show. It was cold, calculated business, treated as simple as an investor statement or press release. 3DO was just trying anything, just trying to get attention, but I think it worked. Kind of. Not really. And of course, Sony, they nailed it. They addressed the crowd like they wanted those journalists to go out and pre-order a PlayStation. This isn't just something that you're gonna wanna buy for your kids or something that you're gonna wanna stock at your store. It is for you. It's a new entertainment medium. And that's why they won. It was great. Congratulations, Sony.